we're talking today about saving reproductive freedom. And as I was saying to a few people who joined us early, I'm sorry, I remember when Roe v. Wade was decided. I remember when Planned Parenthood versus Casey was decided. I thought these were decided issues. I am not an attorney, I'm an engineer. But I really thought that once these decisions were made, we wouldn't have to argue them, particularly 50 years later. And look where we are today. Very excited to support. And when I went to some of our current members and said, who should I contact? What should we be doing in a future event? This was Mary Hertig, who I haven't seen join us today, but Mary said, oh, I'm going to be having dinner with Kitty Kolbert. You have to talk to her. And so thank you, Mary, for making the introduction, because Kitty is widely known as an influential attorney, and she actually argued Planned Parenthood versus Casey before the U.S. Supreme Court and was a founder of the Center for Reproductive Rights. And we have her co-author, who's Julie Kay. And Julie is also a known person in this same space. And she's worked internationally as a human rights consultant, and in particular, working on women's rights. And so we're really happy. A lot of her work is given credit for having given the women in Ireland the ability to get abortions. She's also worked at the Center for Reproductive Rights. Kitty and Julie are the co-authors of this new book called Controlling Women. What we must do now, I lost my slide, what we must do to really secure reproductive rights. And what we have to do now to secure reproductive freedom. And the whole, I have a copy of the book, and the whole theme is what's happened, how did we get to where we are? And more importantly, what are we going to do in the future, and what we must do? You know, Represent's piece of this is electing more women to the Pennsylvania legislature who are going to fight for our reproductive freedom. And as I said, who knew we'd be still fighting this fight in 2021? Represent was founded on the principle of choice. We have a goal of flipping the legislature with pro-choice women leaders. We support candidates who want to do something and not just be somebody. And this is really important because so many of even the Democrats who've been in our legislature have shied away from the issue of choice. They've just want to maintain their job because it's a cushy job. You get good benefits and retirement benefits, and they're just not willing to fight the good fight. And so we review candidates when we're looking at who we might support. We review them looking at their positions on a variety of very important issues, including women's health, including choice, and including full reproductive freedom. These are absolutes in order to get our endorsement and our money. And these issues are under attack. And now let's hear from our speakers.
Well, thanks so much for having us this morning. I love being with a group like you because you get it. You are the evangelists that we need across the country. And I think what Julie and I tried to do with this book is not only tell the story of how we got to where we are today, both legally and socially and politically, using the stories of many of the women we represented over the years, but also to give some guidance about what to do next. What can we do now to save reproductive freedom? And the whole idea here is to not be the definitive roadmap, but to give groups ideas about what they can do, how you can work in coalition, not only with abortion rights groups, but with broader groups that are working for political change. And to suggest that the current strategy, which has been save Roe, save Roe, save Roe, is no longer feasible, is no longer appropriate because we don't have the votes on the current Supreme Court to do that. And we need to turn to other strategies, both political ones, both legislative ones, administrative ones, state court focused, constitutional focused, to be able to make change. And the goal here, in our view, is that each of you will start spreading the word among people who haven't been as active as you have been. Give the book to your daughters, give the book to your friends, give the book to your legislators. We thought the other night, I'd been contacted by a number of state legislators. It'd be great if we could get groups to give the book to every pro-choice legislator in a particular state to begin so that they can begin to think strategically about what their 10-year plan is or what their 15-year plan is, because the opponents of this right have spent 50 years breaking down Roe, seeking to overturn it, have operated very strategically to do so, and we in turn must do the same, have a 50-year plan for how we win back the rights that we are about to lose.
I just want to say how glad I am to be here. It's very cool to have so many boxes that everybody's face looks like a postage stamp. But I think especially just to be in Kitty's home turf and to be so much at the epicenter of a lot of the politics and the political activism that have affected your state, as well as our national view on these issues and our own ability to affect politics. I remember going door to door with Kitty and Joanne for the 2016 election. And you know, it was fascinating to me to hear what people thought of Trump. It was even more shocking and fascinating to hear what they thought 4 years later. And I think, you know, a lot of why Kitty and I want to write this book is because we've both been doing the legal end of it. And as we say in the book, you know, banging our heads against the marble walls of the Supreme Court. And, you know, Kitty did an amazing job with Casey, and we have rights, and it should have sort of put the issue to rest. But instead, we've really seen rights chipped away, particularly for women at the margins, particularly for women of color, for teens, for women in rural areas. And so it's been really exciting to go out to groups such as yours, although you all are one of the bigger and earlier ones. And so we really do want to have time for conversation at the end, because a lot of what our book is trying to do is to spur action and to really reach people and get them to prioritize reproductive freedom generally and abortion specifically. So we're going to read for a bit and then have sort of a broader overview of the book, and then really open it up for conversation with us and amongst us all as well.
Let me start. One of the chapters of the book is told in my voice about the experience of arguing Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And for those of you who don't know, that was the case in 1992 that reaffirmed at least what the court called the hallmarks of Roe versus Wade. It permitted legal abortion going forward and allowed, but the big but was it allowed states to continue to place roadblocks in the path of women, particularly the most vulnerable, as Julie has said. And so while it was a great win, that is, we were very pleased that Roe didn't go completely, enabling states to ban all abortions. It has certainly, over the last 30 years, been used to whittle away at our rights in a very slow motion fashion. But what I wanted to read is the end of that chapter, because I want to just give you a sense of how close we were to losing everything altogether. Years later, I learned that I'd been correct in assuming the worst. At the time of the oral argument in Casey, there had been 5 votes on the court. According to Justice John Paul Stevens' memoir, immediately following the argument, the court had adjourned to their conference room and taken up the Justice, joined by Justices White, Scalia, Kennedy, and Thomas, had agreed that the Court of Appeals had been correct in upholding most of the law. The chief assigned himself the job of writing the opinion. The story goes that before the opinion was filed, Justice Kennedy had a change of heart that ultimately would change the lives of many women for decades to come. Working secretly with Justices Souter and O'Connor, the 3 sought a more tempered approach, and together with only the help of 1 clerk from each of their chambers, began crafting the joint opinion. On May 29, 1992, only 2 days after the chief circulated his draft, which would have ended Roe's protection outright, Justice Kennedy sent a note to Justice Blackmun saying, "I need to see you as soon as you have a few free minutes. I want to tell you about some developments in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and at least part of which I say should come as welcome news." On June 3rd, Justices O'Connor, Kennedy, and Souter circulated a draft opinion among the other justices that supported the Third Circuit's conclusion about each provision, but contained a long and persuasive explanation about why the essential holding of Roe v. Wade once again should be endorsed, continued, and reaffirmed. Justice Stevens and Blackmun made suggestions about how to rework the opinion so that they can join the first 3 sections. The majority adopted most of my suggestions, noted Stevens, and with 5 justices on board for the first 3 sections of the joint opinion, these holdings became binding precedent going forward. It was all about counting to 5. Despite all that has been written about Casey, I still can't be sure what it was that led to Justice Kennedy's changed thinking and his willingness to join the other justices in a compromise that preserved access to abortion for the following 3 decades. It may well have been a shared concern that the court was increasingly being seen as a political body. Rather than having the law turn on settled principles and respected reasoning, Justice Kennedy may have been fearful of having it look like the law turned willy-nilly on the individual political views of the justices, who in turn largely reflected the views of the president who appointed them. That perception threatened to undermine the legitimacy of the court as a neutral body. The enormous negative attention to the court during the Anita Hill hearings just before Casey and the public outcry over the loss of Roe had only exacerbated those fears, as they would years later during the raucous Senate confirmation hearings of Justice Brett Kavanaugh and the highly controversial full speed ahead nomination of Justice Barrett during the 2020 presidential election. Perhaps Solicitor General Starr, admitting during oral argument before the court that a return to a rational basis test could permit states to ban all but life-saving abortions, was just too extreme a step for Justice Kennedy to take. Or maybe he had a greater empathy for an individual's procreative and sexual rights than he had previously revealed. Subsequent to Casey, Justice Kennedy would author 4 major Supreme Court opinions in support of rights for LGBTQ+ people, including his 2015 landmark opinion in Oberfeld, which would for the first time hold that the 14th Amendment requires states to recognize the marriage of 2 people of the same sex. Nevertheless, when some today say that the court would never permit states to ban abortion, I point out how wrong that is. Justice Rehnquist, joined by 4 justices, did so in 1992, and only a late change of heart saved that opinion from becoming law. And now at least 5 justices on today's conservative court are likely to do the same again. I think the moral of the story is don't believe the pundits who say it can't happen. It can absolutely happen. It almost did happen. There are 6 bad votes on this Supreme Court, and whether they continue to whittle and make abortion inaccessible for many, many of the most vulnerable women in this country, or throw the gates open wide and let states ban abortion altogether, we are in for a long haul and need to do everything we can to turn this around. I'm going to let Julie do some reading now too. Thanks.
Thank you. And we do get to the optimistic part of the what we can do now. I think we want to sort of read from the book first and have more of that in conversation. But one of the reasons that we really focus on what went right in Ireland is that Kitty and I really think there's a lot of solutions and ideas and strategies that we can all learn from. So I left the Center for Reproductive Rights. I had started there as a law student and then a fellow and then a staff attorney, working closely and learning a ton from Kitty throughout that. And I had a chance to move to Ireland. So I did, and brought sort of my thought process that I learned at the center there. And so we include a chapter in the book called Meanwhile Across the Pond, a Human Rights Approach to Abortion. So I'm going to read a bit from that chapter. And we start with a quote from Mary Robinson, who was the first woman president of Ireland and the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who says, "Human rights are inscribed in the hearts of people. They were there long before lawmakers drafted their first proclamation. If you use one of those 5th grade line graphs to chart a comparison of abortion rights in Ireland versus the US, it would look like a giant X. Reproductive freedom in the US plummets downward for decades, despite significant medical advances and an increased commitment to racial equity. Rights in Ireland, meanwhile, have skyrocketed. Kitty and I are always looking for new models of affirmative campaigns. What I saw and did and learned about human rights during my years working to liberalize abortion laws in Ireland informs the innovative view of expanding rights that we espouse. I arrived in Dublin in 2000 to discover that abortion was completely illegal. Leaving behind my job as a staff attorney at the center was the downside of heading off to live in Ireland. But I was intrigued by the idea of being abroad and seeing more of the world. Once I married Tom, my Irish-American boyfriend of many years, I could legally work there and would eventually become a citizen. The Irish Constitution ban on abortion had been inspired by the ripple effects of Roe. It was considered the jewel in the crown of the pro-life movement and was enshrined in the Irish Constitution, quote, "The state acknowledges the right to life of the unborn and, with due regard to the equal right to the life of the mother, guarantees in its laws to respect and, as far as practicable, by its laws to defend and vindicate that right." This meant that even life-saving abortion was unavailable in practice. Complementary constitutional provisions prohibited doctors or other counselors from providing information on how to obtain abortion abroad. In modern secular Dublin, women had zero access to legal abortion. In 1973, relying on privacy rights, the U.S. Supreme Court, the Irish Supreme Court had legalized prescription contraceptives for married people in McGee versus the Attorney General. In doing so, it created a legitimate fear that the Irish Supreme Court might also liberalize abortion. By 1983, an increasingly powerful anti-abortion lobby persuaded the government to introduce a referendum allowing voters to endorse a constitutional amendment banning all abortion. At the time, the anti-abortion referendum was a gift to allies in the powerful Catholic Church hierarchy and a much-needed diversion from the government's own scandals, the political troubles in the North, and a failing economy. The amendment was all Irish, but there were clear signs of an American influence. Modeled on the Human Life Amendment that was pending in the US Congress, its aim was to grant full legal rights to an egg from the moment of fertilization. The provision would not just ban all abortions, but would force several forms of contraception off the market and imperil in vitro fertilization and stem cell research as well. An alliance of the Catholic hierarchy and conservative Irish government succeeded in implementing a law, the likes of which the American anti-abortion forces had only dreamed. So I go on to talk about the lawsuit that I brought challenging Ireland's ban on abortion at the European Court of Human Rights. It was brought on behalf of 3 women who really represented a variety of situations and life circumstances that lead women to consider abortion and to have abortions. And that was a very deliberate attempt to really show that we didn't want to just carve out sort of deserving women or just this pocket of women should be allowed to have access to abortion, but we really wanted the court to have to grapple with this issue and why so many women in Ireland were traveling to England and Spain and other countries. When you have illegal abortion, as we all know, abortion doesn't go away, it goes underground. And in Ireland, that meant that women were traveling abroad, which was extremely difficult and stigmatizing and impossible for a lot of women. But it also sort of hid the effects of a ban on abortion. We didn't have in Ireland, when abortion was illegal, we didn't have the kinds of harm and deaths that were happening to women in this country pre-Roe. I think I'll just read sort of, you'll have to either look at the book or ask me questions if you want to know more about the litigation, because I don't want to spend the time reading, but I want to talk about sort of the concluding.
Or they should just buy the book.
Or they can buy the book, yes, but I can't say that. You can say that, but yes.
The book, it gets you excited.
Yeah, so as many people may know, the lawsuit ended in a victory for one of my clients, and we were really able to kind of reframe the debate to have a more human rights approach, which led to a referendum. And this is from the book. Starting in January of 2019, the Irish Family Planning Association was able to provide free legal abortion services within Ireland for the first time. In the IFPA's view, it was a victory with work still to do. In the aftermath of the referendum legalizing abortion, new abortion legislation fell short of human rights standards and best medical practices. Abortion is only available up to 12 weeks of pregnancy unless there is a risk to the woman's life or of serious harm to her health, and in cases of fatal fetal anomaly. An inflexible 3-day mandatory waiting period hampers access to abortion, and many locations lack services. But still, the grass seems greener than in the US as Ireland heads in the right direction. Criminal provisions no longer apply to the pregnant woman. Abortion is provided free to any woman residing in Ireland. Moreover, Ireland continues to be accountable to human rights bodies, and the Irish example has contributed to a growing acknowledgement of abortion as a human right. As the US Supreme Court erodes abortion rights, including the looming possibility of a complete abandonment of Roe, the human rights model is more important than ever. A human rights framework rejects the bogus distinction between saving a woman's life and merely preserving her health when regulating abortion. It rebuffs inappropriate criminal sanctions for abortion and a vindictive lock her up approach to self-induced abortion. A human rights model rejects a system that makes healthcare accessible only to those who can afford to pay for it themselves. Rather, a human rights approach directs governments to support prenatal life by adopting policies that provide full access to contraception, ensure safe pregnancy and delivery, and work to implement a range of socioeconomic benefits that support women who do decide to become mothers. As the US faces a continuing decline in our abortion rights, we would do well to look across the pond for inspiration and strategies.
Thank you, Julie. That was great. I wanted to talk a little bit about where we see this movement going and begin to say what's your piece here that can be used to change the viewpoint. I noticed a question in the chat that said, so who's going to be the Justice Kennedy now? And the answer is no one. Even the one with just a little bit of potential would be Justice Roberts. But remember, Justice Roberts comes from the Justice Rehnquist mode of making decisions. He was very close to Justice Rehnquist, and Justice Rehnquist was the person in Casey who voted to overrule Roe. So I don't think there's a chance that any of the justices will preserve even the most minimal standards of Casey going forward without giving states much greater latitude to restrict at a minimum. And there are 5 clear votes. Justice Roberts is vote number 6. So in many respects, he's irrelevant. And there are 5 clear votes to do the deed. In my view, 4 of those are particularly egregious justices. They care very little about women's rights more generally. And I think we're in that abortion is different enough from everything else to see their natural inclinations to restrict women's ability to obtain these services come forward. The question is, what do we do? And my view is we have to have a long-term plan. That long-term plan in the biggest goal would be adopting a new constitutional amendment that includes not only abortion rights, but women's rights and women's equity more generally that can protect LGBTQ plus rights as well, and give the court explicit language to ensure that these rights remain in perpetuity. But as we've seen with the ERA, this is not a short-term goal. This is a longer-term goal, and one that we've got to start now and work on for the next 50 years.
Sorry, I have to interrupt. We can't say 50 years. I think Kitty and I go back and forth on how many years, but I think the gender equity amendment that we propose in the book is something that is certainly sort of a broad concept and an aspirational goal, but one that we've seen also that in states and state constitutions having a better provision, not having to rely only on privacy rights, but really having something that recognizes gender equity and the intersection with racial equity and providing much more affirmative rights. I'm willing to wait 10 years, Kitty. I'm more impatient.
Well, we'll see. This is good. Impatience is a good thing. The state courts, again, are something that's very critical. Pennsylvania, we're in good shape with the state courts, but we don't know, while they're very good on a whole range of issues, we don't yet know how they're going to rule on the abortion question. There's a case that's pending involving Medicaid funding, a case that I lost many years ago, and where the court said that the right to have funding was not part of the Pennsylvania Constitution. There's a case now that gives them an opportunity to overrule that. I'm not clear, given that 7 of the 9 justices, however progressive they are on other issues, are still Catholic, and they would have to overrule an existing opinion. So working for state courts that are pro-choice are critical. But legislatively, there's a whole lot of things that we can do. Let me just say what's going to happen after Roe. Probably 23 to 25 states will ban at least some kinds of abortion, if not all abortion. And in wide swaths of the country, in the South and in the mountain states, we're likely to see that women will have no access to abortion altogether. There may be, you know, a Kansas here and there that will allow them to travel. But now, unlike the days before Roe, where back alley surgical abortions was what women turned to when they couldn't obtain a legal one, or except for the rich who could go into hospitals, it is true that today the availability of medical abortion will allow women to take pills and self-induce a procedure. And that provides both good and bad. The good is it's safe. The good is it's available, particularly in some states. Probably 17 states will permit legalized medical abortion. But it does mean that women will have to travel or turn to the gray areas of the law or help from other people to obtain a medical abortion. So one of the first things we want to ensure is that medical abortion and self-induced abortion is not criminalized, either for the women themselves or for anyone who helps those women, unlike the Texas law that you might have heard about. The second area that some states have done is pass what's called omnibus laws, which provide by statute the rights that we know under Roe, and that provide additional funding for abortion under the state health plans and federally available funds. And those laws are a really good way to begin to restore the rights to women. And a number of states have done that. Pennsylvania has not. Repeal of the Abortion Control Act and a passage of an omnibus law should be a huge goal for us here in the state. But
I see, Kitty, that 2 of the examples that are really worth looking at are Massachusetts last year passed one over Governor Baker's veto that did a number of different provisions, and Illinois had passed one in 2019. And these omnibus bans, really, they repeal a lot of bad restrictions, but also have a very affirmative right to have an abortion or to get support in continuing a pregnancy and becoming a parent. And they're really, you know, every state is different. And as you all know better than anyone, getting something through the legislature is not easy, but it's a much less compromising bill. And so when it does get through, it can have a really powerful impact. And making sure that it includes funding for abortion is, I think, something that Kitty and I always say is a very big priority as well, because you're not going to get that at the federal government unless the Hyde Amendment, which bans all funding, is changed.
So the next thing I was going to say is what you all do, which is making sure that our legislatures are a majority pro-choice. In my view, the Pennsylvania legislature would be good to be a majority women, and that should be our goal. You know, there's a number of groups across the country that are now working toward making the state legislatures 51% women. Vote Run Lead has started with 3 states, and I think Pennsylvania ought to set that as its goal right away. But in addition to that, I think we ought to think creatively about how we expand access to procedures. and medical abortion. Today, there are about 900 abortion providers around the country, and there are over 9,000 what I call docs in a box or minute clinics all over the country, which provide primary care to people from all walks of life in different areas. Some of those are run by, drugstores like CVS. Some of them are run by local hospital chains. They could be a source of medical abortion very, very easily. They already do pregnancy tests. They already do primary care screening. They are run by doctors and nurse practitioners who have the ability to prescribe. I think we need to set as our goal expanding who provides abortion across the state and looking very seriously at getting universities who run these minute clinics and getting companies that run these minute clinics to begin to expand what they provide and include medical abortion as well. That to me is the law that I love is one passed by California that requires every university clinic, any student health center to provide medical abortion. And that has meant that about 45,000 women have access to this that they didn't previously have. I want to turn to questions. Julie, do you want to add anything more in terms of the strategies?
I mean, I think the kind of the yin to the yang of the legal solutions is also something of that Kitty referenced in supporting women who are self-inducing abortions through medication abortion. Medication abortion is, a whole new technology that has not been embraced in this country as much as it would have been had we didn't have such anti-abortion restrictions and such timidity through the FDA, but it is safe. You need to have support. You need to have, reliable source of the medication. It's not something that we would say is, ultimately something that women should do on their own, but they do globally, and they're starting to more in the US. And I think it's important to recognize that those women are going to need support and assistance as well, and need to not be treated like criminals. In the book, we talk about a case that Kitty did in Pennsylvania of Rosa Hartford, who was criminally prosecuted for assisting a teen to travel to an abortion clinic in New York because it was closer to where she lived, and it also she did not have to do a parental consent procedure if she went to New York, which was, the reason she went to the clinic in New York was because it was closer and available and less of a drive. The woman was prosecuted under a child custody statute for interfering with the custody of a minor. Kitty represented her at a trial, and eventually she was acquitted on appeal. But those are the kinds of stories that we expect to see more of. And the Texas law is one of those where, anybody walking down the street, any guidance counselor, any abusive partner, any, vindictive person can accuse a woman of having had or sought an abortion. And, whether or not that charge sticks is one issue, but also just going through that shaming and stigma in the process is something. So we want to start sort of building up allies more. There's a great history of clinic escorts and defense, and there's a lot of abortion funds that are supporting women. And we really talk a lot in the book about different ways to kind of get involved on the ground with supporting access to abortion. So I want to just put in that plug, but I know that this group is looking for legal means and very politically engaged as well. So I don't want to switch the direction too much on it, and really do want to turn to some of what's feasible politically.
Well, to both of you, we're a group of activists. And one of the things that we've been trying to help, an awful lot of our donors are women who've been active in many different realms. They've been active as, and choice clearly is one that a number of people have worked with. But what we've been trying to do as represent is help to turn our activists into political donors, and tell women they have to vote with their purses, because if you don't push and you don't put money behind good candidates and candidates who believe in what you do, being an activist is a great thing. But so very open to you, though, talking about both what activists can do and what we can do politically. And I think your book makes, I'm giving your book another plug. I think your book is very dense about a lot of those kind of things for people.
Right. So I think one of the things that I've learned, particularly after the last election, is that money is great. It's kind of the bottom rung of what candidates need, and they need to be vocal and they need to have good positions. But the reality is that we lost a lot of state legislative races, even when our candidates were well funded, particularly in Pennsylvania. So we need to change the way the districts are drawn. And the good news in Pennsylvania is we have that opportunity now for the next 10 years. And I think we may pick up some seats with the redrawing of lines because the Democrats are in control of that. But what I really think is we need to think about how Georgia turned things around by really working hard at recruiting new voters, getting young people more active in campaigns, making sure that people who don't normally vote in off-year elections vote in off-year elections. Because remember, Republicans vote in off-year elections, Democrats don't. And that means we're going to have a hard row to hoe on electing pro-choice candidates if our people don't come out to vote in the off-year election. So as much as we can do that grassroots, knocking on doors, writing the postcards, making phone calls, the better we will be going forward in this next election. But I think both on the congressional election and in the state legislatures, we've got a hard row to hoe unless we get a whole lot more people active that haven't traditionally done so. And that means really working hard among our peer groups and our friends and our children's friends to make sure that they get active.
I like that row to hoe, Kitty. We might need to get t-shirts and that in the back with that pun or something. So
yes, I thought I meant road to hoe, but yes.
Yeah, no, we can, in a lot of places we found when they do the transliteration or the closed captioning, they always spell row, R-O-W. So it's a pun that's well launched. I thought we should look at some of the questions in the chat as well, which is, to me, is a little bit like walking and chewing gum at the same time. But one of the questions was, can the Supreme Court completely ban legal abortion or just enable states to do this individually? The short answer is they can allow states to do it individually. I mean, there is a God forbid scenario up there where Congress passes a law criminalizing abortion and the Supreme Court upholds it. What we're looking at right now, if Roe is kind of the floor, the federal level protections are the floor that states can't go below. So if the floor is at legal abortion, if they lower that, they will let states ban abortion completely. So I think when Kitty was talking about the trigger laws, that could happen very quickly in states if Roe were either overturned completely or made pretty toothless. On the other hand, the omnibus laws are kind of the counterpart to that you can increase rights at the state level. And we've seen that happen through some of the challenges and litigation that Kitty and I and others have brought, challenging bans on Medicaid coverage, so that some states are required under their state law to provide funding or to do better and to provide better access. Somebody had asked about expanding the court. I think one of our goals is to get people to realize the Supreme Court is just not that into us. And so if we're really looking at advancing reproductive freedom, I think that there are better places to put our energies than trying to expand the existing Supreme Court or to try to flip that, because we're just so far behind at this point. And we're also doing pretty badly on all the federal court judges and the appellate courts, as well as the district court level. So I'm looking, Kitty, do you want to talk about the availability of medication abortion and practitioners who have religious objections, which was nicely put in quotes for religious objections?
Sure. So the current Supreme Court is doing everything it can, led by Amy Coney Barrett, to ensure that religious rights take precedence over just about any other constitutional right. Used to be that you have to balance those interests. You have the right to abortion, you have the right to religion, you need to accommodate both. But under this court, religion trumps all. I hate to use that verb, but yes, religion wins. And therefore, we're likely to see this court continue to provide exceptions for religious objections. But let me just say, I think that it's a rare pharmacist or doctor who is in this field who has a religious objection. So I think that it is possible to work around religious objections and continue to ensure greater access to women's health care. And to do that, we need to ensure who can provide abortion. So nurse practitioners and midwives, paramedical people who should be able to, who can prescribe drugs in any other circumstance except abortion. We need to change that. But also we need to just think about the availability in a much wider sense and not worry so much about the religious objection, because I have to tell you, there are religions that are very pro-choice, number one, and there are many people within religious groups who are opposed to abortion generally, who themselves are very much with us. And years ago, I brought a case about a Catholic hospital that was refusing to provide abortion services. And we ended up settling the case because the group of nuns who ran the clinic next door decided they'd open the back door and allow women to come in and receive services from them that was different from the hospital and provide abortion services. So you never know where your allies may be.
And you never know when you're going to hear another story from Kitty that I have never heard. And believe me, we went back through a lot of stories. And so now we're going to have to put that one in the paperback version next year.
So anyway, it was, I think the piece for Pennsylvania that's really hard is we don't have control of the legislature. We have the control of the gubernatorial seat, and that has saved us because Governor Wolf is willing to veto bad laws. So I think the number one priority going forward has to be the governor's seat in this next election. We need to elect a pro-choice governor. Obviously, Josh Shapiro is in the running. There's many of other people that on the other side, we can pretty much guarantee no one will be pro-choice. And I think that has to be a huge priority for us if we're just going to maintain the status quo. And then
if you don't want to maintain the status quo, the answer is give my plug. I plugged your book. Now I can plug my PAC. The answer is Represent will only support pro-choice women running. And those are the women who are going to lead change in our legislature.
That's right. And I think the other thing I want to say is resistance has is really an important strategy. I don't know how many of you heard the commencement speech of this young woman in Texas who tore up her speech and read a very moving pro-choice speech. Or we can think about Wendy Davis protesting the legislature. If there are, and what went viral in Pennsylvania with one of our legislators standing up and fighting for women over the objection of the Republicans. Resistance is important, and resistance has to be vocal, and frankly, resistance gets news and allows you to do a better job at what you do. So in my view, every time these bills are brought up, we can't just let them do this because they have the votes. We've got to fight back in a very vocal way. We've got to be there and make a lot of noise. And I think that is for a state like Pennsylvania, which I think of as a kind of middle state. It's not controlled by pro-choice people. It's not an anti, it's really that purple state when it comes to this issue. Resistance is our best strategy and will help in not only securing more women to office, but will help make sure that everybody else understands what's at stake here.
And Let me just say the legislator that Kitty mentioned is Senator Katie Muth, who she is very firm in her beliefs. We're a strong supporter of hers. She's running for re-election this time, and she's going to be a national target to take her out of the Senate because she's viewed to be such a strong leader in the Senate. The other thing about, when Kitty mentions Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania being kind of in the middle, one of the things that has surprised us in our work is in 2018, Sarah Innamorato and Summer Lee, who are both Western Pennsylvania Democrats, won their primaries over traditional, what we always thought of as a Pittsburgh Democrat was an anti-choice person. And I thought of what the work that Summer did and Sarah did was made them unicorns. We didn't think there were pro-choice Democrats in the western part of the state, and they proved that that was possible. Again, these things take a lot of work, but we need more of them.
And I think that's, it's resistance and alliance and building up, allies who have common cause and an outlook that's similar as far as that. So much about reproductive freedom is control, and there, Kitty and I really talk a lot about how it's not about religious freedom. It's the sort of the framework has been within anti-abortion terms, but this really is about controlling women. And it's the same people who want to enforce traditional gender roles, who want to enforce a white patriarchy. And how do you start bringing abortion in from out of the cold and really saying that this is a reproductive freedom and reproductive justice issue. Somebody asked in the chat about bringing in more Latino support. And I think a lot of how that has been happening and has been working is really when we look at the issue of abortion as a human rights issue, as part of the ability to make decisions that affect your decision, who and when and how to have sex and babies, and where there's a overlap of healthcare and access to reproductive freedom, but also really participating fully in life and having these values of liberty and dignity that run throughout human rights law. And I think that when Kitty and I went and looked at sort of the successes of marriage equality and how the LGBTQ+ movement brought that to fruition through a 20 to 50 year plan, but really widening and broadening their alliances. Similarly, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly in the past year or two, really bring in a wider coalition of alliances. And I think that that's something that we really want to see the sort of traditional pro-choice movement bring in a more reproductive freedom, reproductive justice-based movement and start looking at how are people making the decisions about contraception and pregnancy? Is somebody deciding to have an abortion because they don't have the supports that they need to bring a child into the world with housing and food and education, things that we think should be kind of basic human rights? And, we talk a lot about an organization in Pennsylvania called Mom Mobile that really helps predominantly women of color who are looking to access prenatal care, healthy nutrition and supports throughout pregnancy and onwards. And those, I think, are the kinds of models that are going to bring in more allies, people who might say, well, I care about choice, but it's not such a big deal. But really, when we look at what is reproductive freedom, who's making the decisions, who's dictating control over our lives, I think that's when people get up off the couch a bit more. And that's really what we've tried to do through this book is like, yes, things are bad. The sky is gray, if not falling, and has been for quite some time. But really, how do we get people to pay attention to abortion rights, in instances other than sort of rape, incest, and me, as the old joke goes.
Right.
One of the things I would add to that is that we think a lot about creating the conditions for women to choose whether or not to be parents. And so that access to abortion is part of that decision, but access to the ability to raise children in a progressive way, the ability to have childcare, the ability to have contraception, the ability to have family and medical leave and in the workplace, or the ability to not be discriminated against because you're pregnant, are all part of reproductive freedom. The one thing I would add is that currently the care agenda that President Biden is putting forward to enable greater monies, federal monies for childcare, to provide additional resources for family and medical leave, is a huge boon and would be revolutionary to reproductive freedom generally, because it would give families so much better resources to decide to have children. And I think the temporary child tax credit is a really great step. Making that permanent would be terrific. But I do think we are at a time in our political history in Washington where we have an opportunity to change how we think about the care economy as being part of infrastructure, as being part of central to women's ability to function as equals in society. And so that, in my view, is really, really important. If it doesn't happen at the federal level, it could happen at the state level. And I think we need to think creatively about how to get some of those things into state law, or having state law amplify those activities that are going to be going on federally, and think creatively about what some of those things could be.
You know, we're going to have to close it now, but you've got me inspired that we should be sending the book, and we have done a video, and when our video is edited, we'll send it to all of our current state legislators also, because this is really important for them to know. And I think you also solidified one of our overall feelings is that if we elect pro-choice women, there's so many other things that come with them, you know, in terms of, these are also people who care about childcare. They're also people who care about education. There are also people who want to stop befouling the environment. And it's a package deal. I want to thank Kitty and Julie. I learned a lot from reading your book. I've also learned much more about listening to you. I love that the nuns were supporting the abortions, because I love that image. So thank you both. Go out to our participants, both give to represent, and go out and buy this book to get inspired about the things that bad things that could happen, and the way that we're going to prevent them from happening. So thank you very much to our speakers.
Well, thank you so much, and we're really thrilled to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have such a great crowd too. We really appreciate you coming out this morning, especially somebody who had a baby in the picture who was very cute at one point.
I want to give, you know, we've talked about redistricting. There are hearings going on now with regard to the House and Senate races. Joanna McClinton is very clear. She's gotten some push from some of her, Joanna is head of the House Democrats, minority leader of the House. She talks very clearly about the fact that she's gotten some push from some of her, the Democrats, saying, hey, could you make my district a little more democratic so I don't have to have such a hard election? She's not fond of that. She says the most important thing is to give her the gavel, and that by getting the majority. And that really, really goes towards what we were discussing with our guests today. If we don't get the majority and we don't get Joanna the gavel, we can count on our current legislators and our current Republicans to keep us from, and we're going to have to rely on the governor to veto things, which is not the way laws should be done. I'm reminding you that, you know, we talked about this being an off-year election, but we do have a governor race coming up in 2022, and we have a Senate race. And Pennsylvania has supported Dr. Val Arkush. Val was is an anesthesiologist who worked in OBGYN, strong supporter of abortion rights and extending women's rights. Be part of our movement. Go buy this book. We've had the link in there. You can find it if you just go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you buy your books, go buy one and learn more and get active. Go to our website. We'll have the link to the book there, and you're going to have videos from, you know, after we post the video to this, share it with your friends. Volunteer with us and attend future briefings. I'm working right now on trying to figure out what our August briefings are going to be, and we're looking forward to a fall 2022 campaign launch, which will probably include events around the state. So watch for that, and we look forward to you supporting us. As I mentioned, that we'd like you to give to us. None of this happens without money. We did have a lot of money in 2020, but we were not as effective because of the way that the races were won, races were carried out during the pandemic. We had our new head of the HDCC on a recent video, and he's got me inspired. He's the person for information. He's the person who headed the House campaign committee in Virginia for the last 2 cycles, and was the one who really helped figure out the strategy that flipped the Virginia legislature blue and put a woman in as speaker and a woman in as minority leader. And he's now in Pennsylvania, and he doesn't see why we can't do the same thing in Pennsylvania. And I've heard from candidates and representatives from all over the state that Trevor's out there doing a lot of work in this regard. So we're enthusiastic, but it's still going to take some money. So thank you to everybody who participated today, and watch us to figure out what we're doing next. Thank you.
Thank you.